Good morning, everyone. My name's Michael Willard. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Immigration Programs at the Department of Home Affairs. Delighted to be able to be here today at the Migration Hub's Migration Update. We've got 2 full days packed with issues. The Hub's done a fantastic job bringing everyone together with 3 keynote speakers and a range of people with extensive backgrounds in migration. So I can feel the excitement in the room. And for those of you who weren't here for the 8 a.m. start, shame on you, but because it's never too early to talk about migration in my book. But delighted you can all be here, and of course, welcome everybody online as well. This morning, the panel will be looking at the global context of migration. And to do that, we've brought together, or I should say the Migration Hub has brought together, a distinguished panel from across the world who I'll introduce shortly. When I go about the course of my job, I'm often struck when talking with international counterparts how we're all grappling with very similar issues, despite the fact our systems might be very different, our geography is very different. But the sort of challenges that we're looking at are very similar. Needs for skills, challenges with workforce planning, demography and the challenges of an ageing population, and the trade-offs that has to be managed in migration between economic, humanitarian and demographic goals. Always there's a need for better data, more targeted research to inform policy decisions, and to make sure migration debates are based on fact and good information. And we have some terrific presenters here today to illuminate some of those issues from the Australian perspective, but very importantly, from the Canadian perspective and the UK perspective. And I'd like to introduce our colleagues from overseas first, and thank them for braving what is no doubt freezing conditions in Toronto and London to join us online. From Canada, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anna Triandafilidou, who's the Canadian Excellence Research Chair on Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. If you wouldn't mind giving Anna a round of applause so she knows. Now, many of you will be familiar with Dr. Triandafilidou's work. She leads as many as 30 different research projects on migration, with a special focus on the role of migrant agency, the interaction between different drivers of migration, global governance of migration and asylum. She's also the scientific director of migrant integration in the mid-21st century, Bridging Divides, which is an innovative new research program to further understand migrant integration during a time of rapid technological transformation. She has a special interest in issues of identity, diversity, nationalism, and multicultural citizenship approaches, and particularly interested in analysing migration and migrant integration in relation to the wider processes of socio-economic and geopolitical transformation that characterise our 21st century. And from the UK, we have Mr. John Simmons, who's the head of Immigration System Statistics and Refugee Analysis, and the Chief Statistician from the UK Home Office. So if you wouldn't mind giving John a welcome as well. John's responsible for overseeing the Home Office's statistical program, ensuring the production of high quality, transparent and policy relevant data on immigration, as well as crime, policing, fire, rescue and more. And John has extensive experience in migration statistics and sits on a number of national level advisory bodies, such as the National Statisticians Advisory Panel on Migration Statistics. Welcome, John. And last but not least, and in person, I'd like to welcome Nick Latimer, who's from the Centre for Population at the Australian Treasury, and Nick's the Assistant Secretary responsible for the centre. So please welcome Nick. I'd like to ask our guests to commence with their presentation. Once the presentations are finished, we have plenty of time for questions and answers, so really looking forward to those. But first of all, I'd like to invite Anna to provide an overview of Canadian migration and the agenda of the Bridging Divides program, as well as the Metropolis project. Anna, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and big thanks to Alan Gamling and the ANU Migration Hub for this very interesting conference. John and I were just saying while we were connecting on the Zoom link that we wish that we could be in Australia, but unfortunately we can't. But it's still an important possibility to share our thoughts and reflections online. So without further ado, I'll start with sharing my screen to give a bit of a brief overview. So I think Australia and Canada share a lot in common in terms of their immigration history, the way they see immigration in being settler colonial states and immigrant nations, and even in terms of how we regulate migration in the last couple of decades and the challenges and opportunities that we're facing since 2020. I want to focus my presentation particularly on some developments that have taken place during the pandemic and after. So as an opportunity for this conference and this panel to reflect jointly. So as probably many of you know, Canada welcomes immigrants, permanent residents, through three main pathways. One is the so-called economic immigration pathway, so people who come mainly for reasons of employment and through the point system. Family, which is family members, immediate family members of Canadian citizens and permanent residents, and the humanitarian, which is mainly refugee resettlement. Traditionally in Canada, like in Australia, immigration was regulated through permanent immigration. So the idea was that people would apply from abroad and come to Canada, as I call it, on day one as permanent residents. So they had never set their foot in the country, but they would come as permanent residents and with a clear path towards citizenship. And what we have seen happening, certainly in the last 10 years, but more pronouncedly in the last 5 years, is not only a diversification of immigration origins and pathways, but also a rise in the what we call a 2 or 3 step migration. So people who come as temporary foreign workers and then become permanent residents, or people who come as international students, then go into the postgraduate work permit route, and then eventually become permanent residents. And of course, many of the temporary migrants may not stay, may leave. And I believe, like in Australia, there is a bottleneck, or there has been a bottleneck until 2023 at the point of transitioning from temporary to permanent, rather than at the point of entry for temporary migrants. And this has led, as I will explain in a moment, to the introduction of caps, not just for the permanent residence number, but also for the temporary migrants number. Just to give a sense of the size of the population that we're talking about, Canada has approximately 41 million residents to this day, and we admit at this moment just under 400,000 people per year as permanent residents. And actually over half of those more recently are coming from people who are in the country rather than coming directly from abroad. But let me have a look at the composition of this population. So as you can see in this graph, we have a wide variety of countries and regions of origin, and we have seen that new world regions have been rising as places of origin for Canadian immigrants. So beyond East Asia and Southern Asia and Southeast Asia, that were, I would say, relatively traditional places of origin, we see the rise of Central and South America. Canada so far had not a high number of Spanish speakers, but this is changing. And also we see a significant rise of people from the African continent. So the census of 2021, and I'm pretty sure the census of 2026 are showing as the one important, how can I say, takeaway in terms of our immigrant population is the great variety of places of origin, which is like beyond, the former Commonwealth or post-colonial, if you want, routes, and beyond the traditional diaspora connections. The other element that I think is important to note in terms of how Canadian immigration is transforming is the rise of temporary immigrants in Canada. And you can see that we have three different pathways. So one is obviously international students who until 2024 could bring their spouse and children, so their dependents, and spouses until 2024 would have an open work permit. The other category, which was the more traditional category that people in Canada, if you talk to them about temporary migrants, they would think of those, is the temporary foreign workers program. But as you can see, this has become a tiny fraction of temporary immigrants in Canada. And then we have the international mobility program, which includes a myriad of different agreements and initiatives, which I'm pretty sure include a bilateral agreement with Australia for working holiday makers, but also other agreements with different countries and different regions. And they are generally targeting young and highly educated people, or just educated or middle educated people who would come to Canada to gain some professional experience or to spend some time working here, and then they would return. But what we've been discovering is, as I just mentioned, in terms of the 2- and 3-step immigration, increasingly we realize that people have other plans, both because sometimes their plan from the beginning was to stay, but in other cases because, as we know, I mean, humans, we are dynamic and resilient, and our plans may evolve in relation to our experiences, to our opportunities, to our personal situation. One may be a temporary migrant and, start a family in Canada. So obviously intentions and plans are changing. What I think, however, has become more obvious in recent years, particularly after the pandemic, although we can see the trend was there since 2015 for sure, is that non-permanent residents that are coming into the country are more numerous, significantly more numerous than permanent residents. And it's only the last couple of years where public debate and policy debate has focused on the temporary flows. Because until certainly 2022 and even 2023, when people spoke about the plans, they were only thinking of permanent residents with the idea that the temporary residents will come and go. And I would say many people who are not migration experts like us wouldn't even know that, for instance, international students are counted as temporary migrants, or that the spouses of international students could work. When we look at Canada's annual immigration targets, we can see again that they have been on an upwards trajectory, but there's been a significant increase in the so-called levels plan, and the levels plan means the plan that the Canadian government announces every year on the 1st of November. We just had ours a couple of weeks ago, which is about the plan of how many new permanent residents will be admitted to the country in the next year. And actually, it's a 3-year plan that on a rolling basis is updated. So during, just to mention, because I know that was quite different from Australia, during COVID, Canada welcomed temporary migrants to stay, give access to the health system, and actually introduced this distinction about effective residents rather than permanent residents. So it said temporary people who, like people with temporary work permit or other types of permits who effectively have the residence in Canada. So they can show that they're renting a place, that they're sending their kids to school, that they have bills in their name. These people are entitled even to come into the border. So the border was not sealed for these people. And we recognize their contributions to our communities and to the economy. Obviously, we know that many of the temporary residents were working in frontline industries in the health system, including the health system, but also different other frontline services. So there was a very positive response to immigration at the time, and also a concern that Canada needs immigration for its economy to grow and to offset demographic decline, so that it was important to keep, the immigration targets high. After the pandemic, and as has happened in many countries, there's been an inflation crisis, an energy crisis, wars everywhere, and there has been a little bit of a change in both the policy direction and in the public opinion. And I think it would be difficult to say which one came first. Certainly, it was a very noticeable direction And sometimes the same bank economists that in 2022 and early 23 were saying that we need more people, bring them now. The businesses, I mean, we have 1 million job vacancies. Businesses are leaving Canada because they don't have enough talent and enough skills. The same people 12 to 18 months later were saying, oh, the government has flooded the country with new immigrants. So I think it is important to say how abrupt the change in the debate has been, and how you can see in this graph that the targets of permanent residence have been also updated. What has happened in 2024 and obviously continues in this year is that there is now a cap in temporary residence, which is drastically reduced. So to give you an example, in 2023, we had about 1 million temporary people coming, and the cap last year was set to just over 400,000, and this year is under 400,000, and with a significant reduction in the number of international students. However, I think beyond the numbers, and I'm sure you can read those in relevant reports, I also send a link to the new profile on Canada that we published just recently in the MPI website, the Migration Information Source. So you can see all the numbers and the more details of the policy. But I want to speak today a little bit about what has been happening in the last 10 months. So unfortunately, we know there's been a new administration in the United States with a radically different discourse, a very strong anti-immigrant discourse for the United States, but also a very aggressive discourse towards Canada and a very aggressive economic and to some extent even military policy towards the country's security, defense, the Arctic, as well as trade. As we speak, negotiations are still going on between the Canadian and the US government. And a particular feature of this period has been, as I said, this very aggressive debate suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state, but also a complete unpredictability and uncertainty. So in first glance, that has led to a significant rise of new patriotism in Canada, a very inclusive debate that the more we are, the stronger we are. Everybody is welcome and is joining to contribute to strengthening our economy and our society. A very important policy prerogative has been one of trade diversification. As you can imagine, Canada had its largest share of trade and cooperation with the United States. And often when people ask me, how is this Canada-US border? I say, actually, the Canada-US border was a border that was connecting people and businesses, not a border that was dividing. And this is completely, it's a radical change compared to what was there before. So we've seen a significant new patriotism rising. The flag, the Canadian flag, has become a symbol that left-wing and progressive people will wave, where before, as I believe many of you may realize, that waving the flag was more a kind of very nationalistic symbol. The second impact of Trump has been a change in Canadian politics. This time last year, if you ask me, I would say we would, in the upcoming federal election, the Conservatives would win, but this has not happened. Trudeau, who was the previous prime minister under the Liberal Party in Canada, resigned. There was an internal process for a selection. Mark Carney won that contest and went ahead and won the election. That was really a very significant, overturn of all the predictions. And certainly what played an important role there was that Mark Carney had been the governor of the Bank of Canada during the global financial crisis and the governor of the Bank of England during Brexit. So he was seen as a person that can navigate a storm, particularly an economic storm like the one unleashed by the Trump government. Looking at immigration, the top priorities for the government is what they call making the system sustainable, bringing back the immigration system to sustainable levels, which means reducing the numbers of temporary migrants, but also I think, and very importantly, there is a recognition that there's a lot of people with temporary status in the country that have been here for several years, have families, are contributing to society and the economy, and they should be given pathways to permanent residency. So this is happening. And likewise, an emphasis on top talent. And there we can also ask some questions whether Canada or any other economy like Australia, Britain, or for instance, Germany, or the US for that matter, need only nuclear physicists and PhD holders, or whether we also need skilled people in construction, even in IT or in trade that are not necessarily graduates, that do not necessarily have graduate studies and whatever is called high skilled. So the question is, what do we mean by top talent? And on this, and to conclude my comment and my short introduction to Canada, I think Canada, like many high-income countries, is facing three pressing challenges. One is an aging demographics, a rapidly aging demographics that poses questions about how do we reinvent our labor market, our welfare system, our health system to cater for our needs, and how do we do that in a global demographic context where the only continent that keeps being young and that has potential is Africa, because there's been a significant demographic decline in Asia and in Latin America too. Second is AI and how AI is changing tasks within jobs, changing professions, and how this affects everyone, but also immigrants in that sense. And of course, as I said, particularly for Canada, a pressing challenge is trade diversification and how do we operate in this new geopolitical environment. To say a couple of words about bridging divides and the work that we do here. Actually, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to announce that TMU has just launched a Global Migration Institute that builds on our previous big research program, so the Excellence Chair in Migration and Integration, but also the Bridging Divides program that is a multi-university program that we lead, which specifically looks at the impact of advanced digital technologies on migrant integration. So for instance, in employment, in citizenship and participation, in relation to health, but also particularly in relation to our cities and urban planning and urban development. Particularly the role of technologies in everything from migration control to, making our systems more efficient, to connecting us in different ways, and how this impacts migrants is top of mind for us. We look forward to working more with you at the ANU Migration Hub. And also I feel Australia is particularly a kind of a twin country as like in relation to Canada, because as I said, a lot of the challenges and the opportunities that are facing are very similar. Like for instance, when we're talking about regionalization, distribution of immigrants in smaller and medium-sized cities in what is the Australian outback and for us is the North, we have so many commonalities that actually I believe we don't have with European countries or with the United States. And I think and maybe I can say a word about Metropolis, but then John can also chime in because we are partners in crime in that. So I'm very pleased to say, I'm honored to say that I have become the new chair of Metropolis International Migration Network. And together with John and a few other colleagues who are in the executive committee, and particularly Violet Roumeliotis, who is from Settlement Services International in Sydney. Violet actually is the vice chair of Metropolis International. So together with Violet, John, and a few other colleagues, we are revamping some things in Metropolis International. We just had our inaugural smaller conference, but we're planning a big conference in Accra at the University of Ghana from 17 to 20 November 2026. So please take note of this conference in your agenda. We're going to have a program and a call for papers ready in the new year. And part of our commitment in this new phase is, of course, build on the very substantial legacy of Metropolis International, but also decenter a bit our knowledge production and our engagement with policymakers and stakeholders, pay more attention to other continents beyond, say, Australia, Europe, North America, or New Zealand for that matter, and look into what is happening in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anna, thanks so much. I'm sure there's many, many questions amongst the group here. If you could hold those to the end of our third speaker, we'd very much welcome questions on the Canadian system. I am struck too, Anna, how the Canadian and Australian systems really are parallel stories, and there's so many similar challenges and solutions that we look at. I'd like to invite John to join us, and thank John again for what must be a late night in London, finding the time to join us. John, you're among friends here. We've agreed we're not going to mention the cricket, but over to you, John.
Yeah, hi. Lovely to be here. It's a real honor to be invited to this conference, so I'm delighted to speak to you. I'm going to probably do things a little bit in reverse compared to Anna, because I'm going to talk a little bit about my role and what we do in my organization, and then talk a little bit about the trends in the UK and what's been happening over the last few years. One of the things I always say to pretty much every conference I attend these days, actually, is the UK is the largest publisher of statistics on an immigration system in the world. I can't prove it, but my version of research is I ask this question everywhere I go, and nobody has contradicted me or proved me wrong. So I believe that's a fact. We publish lots and lots of data and statistics. The more statistics you publish, that doesn't actually stop people from asking you for more, because I think, if anything, it probably feeds public debate and discourse. I think we have one of the liveliest debates about migration globally in the UK, and we can debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly a lively subject to be working on in the UK. Now, my organization is essentially, it's the research organization based in the Home Office. So our focus is very much on government data, but we also work closely with ONS, and we help improve the products that ONS, our Office for National Statistics, are producing. ONS produce the UK's estimates net migration, and in the Home Office, we publish lots of detailed statistics about the operation of the immigration system, alongside a wide range of other research and economic impact assessments and all sorts. By the way, the next update of both the ONS stats and the Home Office statistics is actually being published this Thursday, the 27th of November at 9:30 a.m. UK time. I'm not quite sure what that is in Australia. Is that Wednesday or Friday? I forget. Maybe it's your evening. Part of our role as analysts or academics within government really is working to provide high quality and independent advice, but with a clear link to the needs of the government of the day. So we pride ourselves really on being a kind of a voice of excellence of analysis within government. Sometimes that entails delivering data to support a very specific set of policy discussions. Other times it may be taking a judgment call as where we can develop new data to help fill important gaps in our knowledge, and we definitely do both. We work closely with our ministers and with policymakers, and they help us assess where we can focus our analytical power to the greatest effect. But we do this as an analysis and insight directorate working inside the Home Office. We've got over 700 staff in total, actually, working on all areas of Home Office business. That's not just migration. That includes crime, policing, national security. One of the great benefits of being part of that large organisation is the kind of links you can build with policing side of the office, with national security issues, but also across different specialisms and skill sets as well. So my statisticians work on all issues across the Home Office and can share kind of, their knowledge and learning in that way. Our links with academia are also important, not least in trying to ensure our advice to the government best reflects the evidence and knowledge on our key topics of interest. We try and present ourselves very much as a bridge between academia and policymakers. That's very much the role of our organisation, bringing academic expertise to bear on policy decisions where we can, but also facilitating academic access to policymakers too, and that's part of our role. Most of the data that we use and that we publish is obviously derived from large operational systems. Obviously the operational systems used to run the UK immigration system. Now, using administrative data in this way is a whole new ball game for statisticians. It's very different from creating your own bespoke surveys, and it raises a wide range of complex technical issues, and we can discuss some of those if you wish, ranging from designing the systems with an eye to the statistics they can produce, or automating the feed and management information across a very complex system so that summary statistics can be published efficiently, and then feeding back a picture of the system to the system itself in a way which is both accessible but also helps to inform the future policy options and decisions that ministers and policymakers have to make. We're constantly changing and improving what we do, moving from traditional summary statistics, reporting on operational process to a much wider range of occasionally deeper data dives actually on specific areas of interest, some of which can become regular output. So, for example, I think we were the first country in the world to publish statistics on LGB asylum seekers. Very, very interesting subset of our asylum data and very informative about the challenges that a lot of LGBT people suffer from in different countries across the globe. We have a lot of better internal data linkages. We've got a long-standing series now on migrant journeys, which basically look at the passage of migrants through our immigration system, where people arrive maybe temporarily, become more permanent, how long it takes them to become permanent, which visa routes they take to get there. And things like also more recently a refugee integration outcomes analysis that my team undertake, working closely with the Office of National Statistics to essentially link Home Office refugee data with a wide range of data from across government to look at refugee outcomes. We've been working with the ONS as well on the replacement of the old International Passenger Survey that was used to measure migration, and they're producing new migration estimates based on lots of administrative data, a large part of which comes from our department, the Home Office. So there's a lot of data sharing now across government in the UK. And obviously we have detailed knowledge of our systems and the data that's provided, which can be massive assistance really to the ONS. We've got innovative use of other existing data sources. We publish new tables of data on work visas by the different sectors and jobs that people take. Asylum claims by the route people take into the asylum system, whether they come on through a regular entry like small boat arrivals, other clandestine arrivals over the ferries and backs of lorries, which is an issue for the UK, or whether they originally entered legally on a visa, as many of our asylum seekers do. We've also got more fluid data production systems in recent years, utilizing RAP techniques to automate a lot of our processes. And an example of that actually is our monthly visa publication. I don't know how many countries across the globe will publish their visa data monthly, but we do now and have done for a year or two. And we're also experimenting with lots of other ways of presenting our data, future use of dashboards, for example, and so on. We could talk a little about the use of AI as well. That's another different area. The news sources that we use are filled with uncertainty and potential confusion, can be easily misleading. It's very easy to produce numbers these days from the massive data that exists in society, but understanding what they mean and putting that data in context, providing reliable and trusted messages to the public and to ministers are essential. And that requires professionally trained independent analysts to do that properly. Other novel sources of data, often hard to obtain or to provide in usable, reliable ways. There's lots of interesting work internationally, as you probably know better than I, on things like mobile phone technology and the data that provides, or use of other sorts of services. I think they can be very useful internationally, probably less relevant to the UK because we can rely on relatively good standard sources, but those are very interesting developments I'm quite excited about. Certainly from a research perspective, they're very, very novel and exciting areas to explore. We are still regularly asked about crisis responses to new migration situations or to forecast future migration trends, and we do that. We do provide advice, but we're very cautious, I have to say, because these sorts of estimates are all very hard to produce with any reliability. But we think we have a good understanding of how migration works in these situations, so provide advice on this basis. And again, that's something else I can talk about. Now, a little bit on the trends in the UK in recent years. I apologise, I don't have any charts and graphics. Well, I could try sharing my screen actually, because I do have charts and graphics, but maybe I'll just talk to you about what's been going on recently. I mean, essentially, migration in the UK comes in two parts, really. This is the way it's spoken about. Legal migration and irregular migration. Now, with legal migration, essentially, we've seen record numbers in recent years. After the pandemic, after we left the EU and Brexit, By 2023, we were receiving over 1 million migrants, over 1 million immigrants. That's immigrants in terms of the UN definition, people who change their place of residence for 12 months or more, so long-term residents. Net migration was over 900,000 in that year, and that's phenomenal for the UK. I mean, there really are record numbers. Prior to the pandemic, we were around the 300,000 mark in terms of net migration. So net migration tripled. Now, it has fallen back in recent years, and it's now back to a level, it's heading back towards the pre-pandemic levels, actually. But that spike has certainly generated a lot of interesting political debate. I'll talk a little bit about that, actually, just at the end. What was driving legal migration spiking in that way? Well, there's a range of different factors. I mean, work migration was part of it. We had particularly following the new immigration system that was introduced after Brexit in 2020. It was a much more liberal system, and a lot of people refer to the spike in numbers as the Boris Johnson peak in migration, really, because it was associated with the immigration system that he introduced. Much lower thresholds for work migrants meant there was a lot more lower skilled migrant coming in than was previously the case. We also had a very large number of foreign workers coming to work in the health sector, particularly the care sector, which was suffered a great deal actually from EU migrants, EU workers who left after Brexit. But we also had some very sharp spikes in numbers of foreign students and some increases as well, quite significant increase, people coming from particular global crises like Ukraine and Hong Kong. And I mean, I think Ukraine schemes are well known. We had probably a couple of 100,000 people arrive from Ukraine in the UK after Russia invaded. But I think what's lesser well known is the scheme that was introduced by the same Conservative government for Hong Kong, British nationals overseas in Hong Kong, British national passport holders in Hong Kong. Again, one of the most generous and open and most liberal immigration schemes of recent years. I mean, second probably to Germany's offer to Syrians, I would say. But again, we had a couple of 100,000 people come from Hong Kong under that scheme. And what's amazing actually is it was a very liberal scheme, but nobody talks about it. And it's not subject to public debate. The other half of the equation on migration in the UK is essentially irregular migration. You may have heard about this. You may have read about it in the newspapers. Numbers are much smaller, but they are very significant in terms of their political impact. A lot of people talked about small boat arrivals who come from northern France across the English Channel. Started in 2018, really, but really only picked up during the pandemic when normal routes into the UK were closed, and then they grew and they've not subsided since. So we had around 40,000 small boat arrivals across the English Channel in the latest year. There's a lot of involvement of organised crime, and obviously a lot of collaboration between the UK and France now to try and address this, but we've not succeeded in addressing this issue yet. But many asylum seekers also arrive through legal migration routes, and around 30% of our record levels of asylum applicants last year, over 100,000 asylum applicants in the UK, around 30% came on legal visas, work visas, student visas, and visitor visas, and so on. Now, just to finish off, it's worth talking a little bit about public opinion in the UK. Post-Brexit, significant rise in popular support for migration. I mean, the UK was quite cynical about migration under the old Conservative government, and you may have heard of their tens of thousands target for net migration. After Brexit, public opinion was very positive about migration, meaning the UK in the last few years has actually become much more like Canada and Australia in its attitudes towards migration, according to opinion polls. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether that survives the current political discourse, which is quite fervent, really, in terms of, and driven particularly by the trends in irregular migration, the small boat arrivals, but not just that. It'll be interesting to see what happens politically. New Labour government was elected with a very large majority in Parliament, not in the country, which is again another significant issue for the support it has for its policies. But it introduced a new legal migration statement early in 2025 under one Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. And it's subsequently published, well, in fact, about a week ago, it published a new asylum strategy under our new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. Will they work? Will they do enough? I think there are actually strong signs that there will be the sorts of impacts the government wants to see in migration. Legal migration, as I said, is heading back down towards the levels it was prior to the pandemic. So in terms of the aims to reduce net migration, the government will probably be able to claim success. Whether it will stop small boat arrivals, much harder to say. Certainly that's proven to be a much tougher nut to crack. That's basically a picture of migration in the UK. So I'm going to end it there, but I really look forward to your questions and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
John, thanks so much. Now, I'd like to invite Nick Latimer from the Australian Treasury Centre for Population to join us. Now, Nick has very generously agreed to cut his presentation short, so he has the challenge of keeping it to just a few minutes, so we have some time for your questions at the end of the session.
Yep, thanks. All right, thank you, for having me today, just as we get wound up to start. So, yeah, grateful for the opportunity to speak, and glad to say, for me, my third time speaking at ANU this year in various forums, which has been really good collaboration. As mentioned, the Centre for Population is located in the Australian Treasury. We're a whole of government centre for expertise on demographic issues, including net overseas migration, which has been a major focus of our work for the last couple of years. So the past 5 years in Australian migration have been quite remarkable. We've gone from the first period of negative migration since the Second World War, followed by the highest migration on record. And during that period of negative migration, you can find an article online from the Fin Review that reports the advice that the New South Wales Premier's Department gave to Dominic Perrottet when he became Premier there in about 2021. And the advice was that he should advocate to the Commonwealth to aggressively, I think the word is actually aggressively increase migration to something like double its usual rate, which is what happened. But fair to say that's been a matter of significant public debate over the last couple of years. So it is remarkable to think back that a bureaucracy was giving that advice at that time. I will try to move quite quickly, but I just want to step back and consider these past 5 years in 3 ways. So one is just giving some historical perspective, also an international perspective, which we've heard from the previous speakers a little bit, and thirdly, a demographic perspective. So starting with the history, as many of you would know, every 5 years, the Australian government is required by law to produce an intergenerational report. And these reports provide 40-year projections of the population, the economy, and the federal budget. This chart shows the population projections over the report since 2002. And it's quite remarkable that in 2010, the IGR projected that Australia's population would be 27.5 million in 2025. And in the March quarter of this year, that's what the population passed. But the way that we've got to 27.5 million is quite different to what was thought back in 2010. We've had higher migration than was expected back then, and lower fertility. But yeah, in amongst the debate at the moment around population growth, population pressures, I find it really remarkable that when you think back, we're basically where we thought we would be 15 years ago. Turning to the international perspective, this is a chart of international population growth rates, and you can see the volatility that overseas migration has caused over the past 5 years, particularly for Canada, New Zealand, and in the green, Australia. You can see that both Canada and New Zealand peaked higher than Australia, and they've come down a little more sharply as well in their population growth rates. In terms of international perspective, I think we've heard a lot about Canada already, but it is interesting to keep an eye on what's happening in New Zealand. So I haven't seen the New Zealand government explicitly say that it's trying to lift migration, but I think you can see when you look through their policy announcements over the last couple of years, they're certainly looking for ways to boost skilled migration. And they've also set a target of doubling the contribution of international education, international students to their economy over the next few years as well. And for New Zealand, obviously they're making those choices to try and lift arrivals in the context of facing a significant number of departures to Australia, reflecting our relatively stronger labour market. Turning to Australia, and John mentioned the challenges in migration forecasting. So I'm going to look at those briefly and what's happening in migration in Australia. Before I put the chart up, I should note that part of what the Centre does is produce the government's official population forecasts, and we publish these twice a year in the federal budget and in MyEFO, and also our publication, the population statement. The population statement would expect to come out later this year, maybe early next year, and MyEFO as well, typically in December. So what I'm using today is not the MyEFO forecasts, just to be very clear. I'm not in position to share those, but what I'll show you is what we had in budget earlier this year, and the actuals released by the ABS. So this chart just plots the Centre's net overseas migration forecasts over time since 2021. And you can see that we've had successive increases, and that we did struggle to anticipate the size of that post-COVID rebound as forecasters in New Zealand and UK also experienced. So here the solid lines are the ABS actuals that were available at the time of the forecast, and the dashed lines are our forecasts. There's probably two things I want you to take from this chart. One is that we did have some challenges, but also that you can see how our forecasts have started to bunch up as we've come through time. And if I add the actuals as well in that black line, you can see that maybe contrary to some of the public discussion, migration's actually tracking slightly below our budget forecasts, and even those from a year previous in MyEFO last year. And I think the Treasurer's remarked publicly that we're tracking 17,000 below the forecast for 24-25 to date. The second thing to take away from this chart, I think, is just following that black actual line, that migration has peaked and is coming down. The decline's been driven by fewer temporary migrant arrivals, particularly by those on student and visitor visas. Although, as reported in the press over the weekend, we are seeing continued strength in working holiday makers and also New Zealanders. The other thing is just to remember that this is a net measure, and although the surge was really caused by a surge in arrivals, where a lot of our focus is now is on departures. Departures have picked up in absolute terms since 23-24. But we can see that migrants on temporary visas are departing Australia at lower rates than they have in the past, and this is a key challenge for our forecasts going forward. I'll just very briefly just note, like, here we are in Canberra, and often the debate around these issues can be quite focused on how things feel here and in Sydney and Melbourne. It's really worth bearing in mind how population growth is concentrated in our largest cities, partly because of migration, but partly because of younger populations that are having more babies. And that if you're sitting in Hobart or Adelaide, probably your perspective on population growth will be very different, because growth is much lower there. And when you talk to people from there, they're really keen to see it higher. And just very briefly on the demographics. So So it's just showing in this chart how migration has helped to slow population ageing in Australia. Obviously, that's happening for us in the context of declining fertility, which has been a major public debate around the world this year, and also some of the highest life expectancies in the world that we have. The migration system was significantly reformed in the 90s and 2000s to deliberately target younger and more highly skilled migrants. But if you go back and look at the rate that our median age was rising at prior to the year 2000, the median age would be much higher and would reach about 55 by the end of our projection period in the mid-2060s, which is 12 years higher than what we projected in the population statement last year. And just one final note is that within this within this overall demographic picture, our working age population continues to grow. And this is a real source of economic resilience for Australia. So today, around 40% of OECD countries have declining working age populations. Using the UN projections, by the 2060s, that will grow to about 90% of OECD countries will have declining working age populations. By contrast, in our projections, Australia's working age population will still be growing, and that's a great source of economic resilience and support for growth for us. But we want to fit in some time for questions, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, for being so accommodating and also for sharing so much information in a short time. Over to you for questions for any of our panelists. I think there's some roving microphones, so if you raise your hand, you can see a hand up in the middle there. And could you indicate which panelist you're asking the question to, please?
Good morning, everyone. I have a question for John Simons. In Australia, it's very hard to get update on policies from UK or specific cities. I would like to know if you could give us an update of the agreement or at the time of Boris Johnson with Paul Kagame, a multi-millionaire deal that anyone arriving at the shores of UK would be automatically relocated to Rwanda. Is that still on? And what is the strategies and the updates on that?
No, it's definitely not still on it. When the Labour government was elected last July 2024, one of the first things they did was to essentially end that policy. The policy, although it was spoken about a lot, I think it resulted in 4 people actually going to Rwanda, all of which were volunteers. And I think the Labour government decided that it simply wouldn't work, as well as being potentially extremely costly. So no, it's absolutely been cancelled.
Thanks, John. I think we have a question down the front here, and then I think we have one in the back in the middle. I've got some bright lights in my eyes, so I can't quite see. But
thank you very much. This is a question for Anna. Especially for Anna. Also, I wouldn't mind Nick's comments because of the similarities between Canada and Australia as well. You mentioned a little bit in passing the issue of the new patriotism, and which goes to national identity in Canada. So I was interested in this topic because with so many populist governments or populist parties gaining strength in many of the Western countries today, there's the need of presenting a different kind of national identity, a source of unity, so to speak. Could you expand a little bit more on the source of this new identity and the role that you think it has, or it could have, the positive role in uniting not only Canadians, but also all the new migration? And I know that your perspective is different, Nick, but as well, probably you could comment a little bit on that because you mentioned the population decreasing fertility here, but there are new migrants having babies and so on. So that is also yeah, if you had any comments on this, would be very interesting on a positive source of unity for our countries.
Thank you very much for the question. I think there are some specificities in Canada. Sorry, in Canada that probably don't hold for Australia. So it's like, you won't mind saying it's like Ireland and Britain. Like Canada is the second largest country in the world, but it has 41 million, and the US has 340 million. So we are the small cousin next to a big neighbor. And historically, Canada has defined to a large extent its national identity as different from the United States. So both in the first Trump presidency and the current Trump presidency, certainly the US becomes a very important, significant other from which to differentiate and distantiate ourselves. So it is a very strong narrative. We're not like them. We're not racist and xenophobic. Like, and this is not a judgment for the American people and the US citizens and residents. Although it is true that many millions of people voted for this government. This government won a landslide victory. So that is a concern. So there was clearly a way to differentiate and say in Canada we still uphold the value of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, of, for instance, not defending ethnic hatred and racist speech in the name of free speech. That has created this positive moment, and also the feeling of being attacked verbally, but also true feeling that you could be attacked militarily, territorially. We may have forgotten now the attacks of the US administration to Greenland, to Denmark, to Canada itself. And it is a true issue. Arctic trade, Arctic navigation, Arctic security is a true issue with climate change. So certainly that provided the context. At the same time, my feeling is, and as someone who has worked a lot on nationalism and migrant integration and identity, is that this reaction was an inclusive one. It wasn't like, oh, new immigrants go home, we need to cater for ourselves. It was like, we are all in this together, and what makes us different from our neighbor down south is our different values. Now, I believe that such a dynamic can function in many countries, but it has to do with this dynamics of us and them, and how you differentiate and unite with one another. And I'm pretty sure if Australia was closer geographically, like, because you have to think of the particular morphology of Canada. Canada is 3 oceans and the United States. So it is a very particular geographic position.
Thanks, Anna. I think we have one. We have Peter McDonald has a question as well, but we have one at the back, and then Peter, we might finish with you as the final question.
Thank you. This is a question for Nick. We have a settlement outcomes, we have a multicultural framework, we have migration updates, but we continue to lack a population policy that is a structure around that. So I wondered if you could speak to that. I see the conversation around it pop up from time to time, but it seems like a gaping hole in our sort of architecture around migration.
Yes, and yeah, that's working, isn't it? So yeah, I think over time, there's quite a good parliamentary library article that looks at the history of population policy over time in Australia, and over many decades, it's tended to just get to the point of being more proactive and then step back to a more laissez-faire approach. Is what my centre tries to do is to really provide the information, the forecasts, publicly and in greater detail than the Commonwealth ever has before, that allows all levels of government to do the planning that they need to do. We also have some work underway with the states and territories and local government as well, a group that we lead. On the migration side more broadly, and might want to talk about this, but there's considerable work that the immigration minister leads. It's a roundtable with his state counterparts and sort of state level migration planning underway as well. But yeah, is there anything you'd like to share on that?
Thanks, Nick. I think, as Minister Thistlethwaite mentioned, a whole lot of consultation. There's also a skilled advisory council. We'll quickly move to Peter for the final question. I'm just conscious we're running a few minutes over, but Peter, over to you.
Yeah, quick question for Anna. I'm asking about the rationale of the reduction in the permanent program in Canada in the last couple of years. So was it based on economic demographic modelling? Was it based on labour force needs? Or was it something else?
Yeah. We talk a lot about evidence-based policymaking, but I think at best we can have evidence-informed policymaking or policy-based evidence-making. I think the reduction in permanent residence, so as I explained before, certainly there was a moment in 22, 23 that we had 1 million jobs going unfilled. And our unemployment rate was just under 5%, of 4.8, 4.6. And right now our unemployment rate is just above 6%, which is still not huge, but among youth it's about 12 or 13%, which is concerning. And so there were a few easy mathematical equations that were made into the public debate. So one is that the rise of the cost of housing, in particular, both rentals and, purchasing a house in the big cities was driven by newcomers, which was honestly a very simplistic analysis of a very complex issue where the lack of public funding for social housing, zoning laws, like laws that define what kind of residences you can have, how you divide the lot, how people can coexist in where it used to be one residence, etc. So a lot of such issues of urban planning were crippling like cities from addressing affordable housing, including, of course, those global cities everywhere around the world being the target of wealthy individuals who may seek to relocate to Sydney or Melbourne or Toronto, Vancouver, London, Paris, and you name it. So that was one thing. Then the idea that unemployment was rising because of incoming immigration and no consideration of the sector-specific impact of new immigrations, such as, for instance, in the health system, where a lot of the new immigrants are catering, like our nurses and paramedicals and, biomedical technicians and in a lot of these sectors. So no sector-specific analysis, no analysis of the broader demographics and the fact that actually, apparently in 2020, the demographic reproduction rate in Canada was standing at 1.5, and now it stands at 1.25. So it's very low when, as you know, that we need close to 2 for a society to reproduce itself. So I think it was very much a knee-jerk reaction rather than a long-term planning. At the same time, I want to say that right now, the new levels that were announced together with the budget for 2026 were slightly lowered compared to last year. So I think we are now at 365,000. But there are special programs for people who are already in Canada that add another 75 to 80,000. And I think that's very important because, as I said, people are not packages. When someone has been living here for whatever policy planning purposes, people have been here with a temporary type of permit for 6, 7, 8 years. They've started families, they have jobs, they have houses, like they're not taking anyone's housing because they're residing here already. You can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, policy changed, go back home. It's not that easy. Of course, many people will have to go back home, but we need to have a broader view, and I'm happy that the government has understood that.
Thank you, Anna. And ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause for our panelists?
Anna, John, and Nick.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy your conference.
Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks again to the Migration Hub, Alan and the team for organising the tech, and Tom on the IT for making that all go very smoothly across many time zones. Thanks, everyone.